Well, it's time for tonight's panel and to talk about transformation in both the financial services sector and the construction sector. It's been a key agenda for government this year, and we had the amended financial services sector codes and the construction sector codes published in the Government Gazette on Friday. So they're now legally binding documents on all players in those sectors. And just to have a look at what the Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davies was saying about the financial sector codes, they make provision for no less than 122 billion rands to be spent by the financial sector on empowerment financing. But there are also some issues. The minister said these newly gazetted codes would have to be reviewed again to take into account the recommendations of the report on the transformation of the financial sector. So to me, that just creates further confusion. Why release them in the first place? Now you've got to plan and replan anyway. I'm not the minister. I'll find out tonight what our experts on b-bbee think about all of this. On the line, we've got Richard Riding, Divisional Head for Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment and Global Business Solutions. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Michael. Pleased to be with you.
And in studio, Lianne Friedman. Was Lianne Levenstein the last time we spoke, Lianne?
Yes.
So congratulations on your nuptials, CEO of EconoServe.
Yeah,
welcome.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
Now, Richard, just kick us off on the financial sector side of things. It's been in the spotlight in Parliament this year over the sector's perceived lack of transformation. These specific codes have been long awaited. Until now, we've had the sector adhering to the original financial sector codes, which have given the sector a bit of an unfair playing field over all other industries. I think been 4 years in the making. What led us up to this point?
Well, basically, we've had the situation where, as you say, there's been a large amount of people talking about it's so unfair. The financial sector hasn't actually been funding b-bbee deals. They haven't been looking at where to spend money, how to spend money, and looking at way to transform South Africa. Because, as I think the minister himself said today, that we need to. It's very important because we can't do these deals without money. And so, if the banks and people in the financial services industry are not funding it, it's very difficult to transform.
Lianne, when we look at this, one thing that jumps out at me is that they've been gazetted, and that means they're immediately law. There's no transition period once again.
Yes, correct. This precedent has actually been set very, very often. The most recent one, and I think probably one of the biggest issues, was the ICT sector code that came into effect immediately and actually had a different points to level table, which means companies really struggled. But the precedent that has been set is that these two pieces of legislation will need to be effected immediately. So this really leaves a lot of companies whose year end is December with really only 2 weeks to align with this new piece of legislation in time.
And Richard, I mean, that makes planning almost impossible. I mean, how does an organisation the size of Standard Bank or Nedbank or ABSA with 30,000, 40,000 employees all of a sudden make a plan in 2 weeks? I mean, obviously there's been the old codes and there's been drafts out there, but no one has known in black and white what the final version's going to look like.
Well, that is the issue. Is the minister and the DTI have said in the past that with the immediate gazetting or the gazetting for immediate effect, that you've had the draft. But now, if all of a sudden you have certain cases where things are totally different or things have changed from the draft to the final document, it becomes incredibly difficult to plan. And business is prepared. Most business people are prepared to do a lot of things, provided they have got time to plan. So now all of a sudden you're sitting, and as you said, you've got 2 weeks now to look at how do we actually change our measurement, and most likely all the recording of stuff like skills development, which in the past was done as a percentage of leviable amount. It's still done as a percentage of leviable amount, but now all of a sudden you've got to start looking at your training per management category. You don't even need to look at demographics. You know, it really becomes incredibly difficult for business to actually plan and to do things like that. It becomes difficult.
Difficult, if not impossible. But Lianne, looking through the final version now, and what stands out for you from the draft and the old codes, what really jumps out at you?
Yeah, something that I've actually realized is that perhaps there are faults. We know that there's faults. There's faults with a lot of pieces of legislation. But one part of this is maybe looking at an opportunity of growing and developing. So obviously with the example of the access to finance and all of that, the empowerment financing and all of that, perhaps that could be viewed in a positive light and a way of actually growing one's business. And if done correctly, the likes of the big banks could actually end up being a lot more profitable in their businesses and a lot larger reach in terms of the country and the geographical areas that they can actually target. So I suppose it depends what view you want to take. And as I say, don't get me wrong, I can criticize as well, but there is an opportunity to maybe look at it positively to grow.
I hear what you're saying, but Richard, surely the banks are in the business of growing their books, of growing expanding their markets, grabbing market share, and ultimately they want to be lending money. They want to make more borrowers of consumers, of businesses. The problem is not many consumers, not many businesses are credit worthy. The banks have various credit metrics and criteria. How can we impose upon the banks to whom to lend and on what basis?
Well, and that's what it's very difficult to do that. And like I take Lianne's point, it is a very valid point. But to say, having said that, a lot of that empowerment funding hasn't actually changed significantly from the old codes to the new codes. In fact, in the new codes, if you have a look in a couple of areas specifically there, they state that that these figures will need to be reviewed in January 2018, which is in 6 weeks' time. I beg your pardon, it's 4 weeks' time. And so there's another area there with that. But they're also trying to take a bit of a stick. If you have a look at in the codes, they say that businesses in this sector must report annually to the Financial Sector Charter Council. If they do not report, there's provision for them to be named and shamed, and there's an automatic discount on the next certificate. So the problem comes is, yes, businesses will want to grow profit, will want to do everything like that, but at the same time they've got a stick looming over their head saying like, do this or else we'll smack you.
And then, Richard, is that in addition to the priority element discount?
That's in addition to. It looks like to me it's in addition to the priority element. Yes.
Lianne, I mean, one doesn't want to be overly critical. Balanced, I think, is what we're looking for. If you have a look through the codes as they stand, one issue that also jumps out at me certainly is that it's been reported that CEOs will now be made responsible. I was reading an article published on MoneyWeb, I think it was, by Ray Mashlaka, who's had a look at the codes and said the b-bbee Commission is now expecting to develop a system of fines for non-compliance. And the buck might soon stop with the CEOs of financial services firms for the failure to fast-track transformation. And that seems fairly punitive.
Yeah, well, I mean, to give you a bit of background as well, the b-bbee Act also, in terms of criminalizing fronting, means that the CEO or anybody involved in the b-bbee process is in a position where they ought to have known. So in the same way as they need to implement actual, meaningful transformation, they also need to be very aware that if they've got a procurement department that is asking for supplier certificates, they've got to make sure that those certificates are actually valid. Otherwise, again, the buck stops with the CEO, and the penalties for the fronting activities in terms of the Act is actually 10% of a company's turnover, or up to 10%. 10% of a company's turnover, or up to 10 years in jail.
Or 10 years in jail. I mean, Richard, that is extremely onerous, and I think to look at what the Parliament's Standing Committee on Finance, which has been chaired by Yunus Karim, has been looking for, that was one of the major recommendations. They really wanted to come down hard on the CEOs of the big banks, and it looks like they've achieved that.
Correct. It is a big thing. Like, as a consultant, I often talk to people And, they're saying, guys, do we actually need to now go out and get legal advice as to whether the structure that you're proposing or what you're talking about doing, whether there's actually a front or whether it's not. It actually has got a lot of people very, very concerned. Because, I've got no desire to put something together and put something to a client and have a client act on, which it gets turned out, which gets regarded as a front, because, heck, that's... I also don't want to sit in jail for 10 years.
No, well, that's it. I mean, obviously, it's an imperative to ensure that the economy is deconcentrated, for lack of a better word. We see the competition authorities coming out with their amendments now targeting that specifically. But how realistic and practical are some of the targets? Let's just talk about skills development and what it says there, Lianne. I mean, is it in the realms of practice and practicality?
Yeah, so the targets on the FSC sector code for skills development is 14.5%. As Richard mentioned earlier, the FSC code specifically look at
14.5% of what?
14.5% of the company's payroll.
14.5% of your total payroll you have to now spend on skills development.
Correct. And to go one step further, you have to make sure that spend is in line with the company in terms of you've got to spend on your senior management, your middle management, your junior management, and then your non-management. So that's basically everybody else in the company. And interestingly enough, they've only allowed 1.5% for spend on people who are unemployed, whereas the amended codes of good practice focus quite a lot on the spend with people in general as opposed to employees. But to come back to that, 14.5% is a really high number. Of that 14.5%, 9% needs to be spent on females.
Now, the upshot for me, Richard, in an economy where most businesses are on the margin because of the economic drought that we've been experiencing, you're not going to be employing any more staff in an environment where 40.5% of your salary bill's got to go for training and skills development. In fact, you're creating a disincentive here, in my opinion, to job creation.
Oh, yeah, and to some extent, when the first thing that a company will look at cutting when they're going through a hard time or when they're looking to cut costs is development.
Sorry, Richard, we're losing you there. If you could just talk into the mouthpiece a little bit.
Okay. The problem comes in a bad economy. To exacerbate the issue, in a bad economy, what's one of the first things that companies look at cutting when times get bad? Is skills development. They create, I agree with you, they're creating a problem, they're creating a thing where people are just going to sit there and say, hang on guys, is this really doable? Even under the general codes where you're talking about 6%, guys are saying like that is absolutely undoable, we can't meet that. Whereas now with this 14.5%, while I think we all agree that it's something that is very necessary that we do train our staff, it just becomes undoable, unmanageable. A client of mine in a different industry did a thing the other day where they sat there and said, under the general codes, how much is this actually going to cost us? And they quickly calculated everything, and they came to a figure of 14.5% on net profit. So, the thing comes, 14% on net profit. So now all of a sudden you're talking about a company that's got to spend 14% of payroll on this. It could start having serious profitability, serious shareholder impact, because most of these companies obviously are going to be listed entities too. So it's going to have a serious impact.
And, I would just love to know, and maybe I'm asking the impossible considering which way the government leans, but when will our leaders realize that the only way to achieve a prosperous, peaceful, successful South Africa is via competition in the market and in the global market here? We are making ourselves less competitive globally through this, Lianne.
Yeah, not only our b-bbee legislation, but we've got employment equity laws, we've got labor laws that really basically harms any... I hear Richard laughing on the other side of the line. We probably feel in the same sentiment that in terms of the labor laws, companies don't want to employ a lot of people because if somebody isn't performing and isn't doing a good job, it's going to cost you 3 or 4 months to follow that procedure correctly, to dismiss them correctly, otherwise you'll end up in the CCMA.
Paul.
So it's, yeah.
And not only that, but most companies that I deal with are multinationals. And they're sitting there, and their head office, wherever, is saying, guys, no more heads, do more with less, headcount freeze. These are all terms that have been thrown around at the press because of the environment in which we're working.
Yeah, and they don't always understand the context, but that's the result of it.
And yeah, obviously our context is important, and we cannot gloss over that. But we far more importantly cannot gloss over the fact that we are an integrated, open economy trying to compete with the rest of the world, trying to compete with the rest of Africa, and it just seems our policymakers are doing everything in their power to be that team member that is ensuring we drop those high balls in the back three. Let's just touch on I always said constriction, and there's probably a Freudian slip of some note that the construction sector codes, and they've had a very interesting history. Lianne, just take me through the background to these.
Sure. So the construction codes originally came out in back in 2009, and when the new amendments came through, they were actually for a certain period repealed. So a lot of the construction companies followed the normal codes of good practice from 2007 to 2009. Then 2009 until I think it was 2015 or 2016, it was then repealed, and we needed to follow the codes of good practice. And then now we're following the codes of good practice, the amended codes of good practice, and now we've got our new legislation.
So I'm thoroughly confused, and you're an industry practitioner. What are the big changes quickly with these, Richard?
I beg your pardon, I didn't get that.
What are the big changes in the construction sector codes? I see, for one, that it looks like the enterprise development has been removed, and you've now only got supply development.
Yeah, there's two sections there: supply development programs and supply development, no enterprise development. Other things that I picked up on a very quick read of the codes. For procurement, you're talking about 51% black ownership and 35% black woman ownership when you're looking at procurement. All companies must report to the Charter Council. There are very specific requirements with regards to the verifications of companies. EMEs and QSEs, even black-owned EMEs and QSEs, need to have a limited verification specifically around their skills development, or else if they don't meet the targets there, they could also be discounted, even though they just need to get affidavits. So there are some interesting changes under the construction charter too.
Lianne?
Yeah, and just to add to that, I find quite interesting the scope. The scope used to be only contractors and your built environment professionals. It's now been expanded to include construction material suppliers. So a company, for example, who supplies bricks to a contractor now needs to follow the construction codes, whereas previously they followed the codes of good practice.
That is an important change. Well, you judge for yourselves whether or not these new sector codes in finance and construction are constructive or constricting. I'll let you be the judge. That was Lianne Friedman, CEO of EconoServe, and Richard Riding, Divisional Head of Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment at Global Business Solutions. And from me, Michael, producer Slu Paho, and sound engineer Mdu Tlale. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Good night.